Selections from the Critical Fragments, Lyceum Fragments, of Friedrich Schlegel. 7. My essay on the study of Greek poetry is a mannered prose hymn to the objective quality in poetry. The worst thing about it, it seems to me, is the complete lack of necessary irony, and the best, the confident assumption that poetry is infinitely valuable, as if that were a settled thing. 8. A good preface must be at once the square root and the square of its book. 9. Wit is absolute social feeling, or fragmentary genius. 12. One of two things is usually lacking in the so-called philosophy of art, either philosophy or art. 14. In poetry, too, every whole can be a part, and every part really a whole. 18. Novels have a habit of concluding in the same way that the Lord's Prayer begins, with the kingdom of heaven on earth. 20. A classical text must never be entirely comprehensible, but those who are cultivated and who cultivate themselves must always want to learn more from it. 21. Just as a child is only a thing which wants to become a human being, so a poem is only a product of nature which wants to become a work of art. 23. Every good poem must be wholly intentional and wholly instinctive. That is how it becomes ideal. 25. The two main principles of the so-called historical criticism are the postulate of vulgarity and the axiom of the average. The postulate of vulgarity, everything great, good, and beautiful is improbable because it is extraordinary, and at the very least suspicious. The axiom of the average, as we and our surroundings are, so must it have been always and everywhere, because that, after all, is so very natural. 26. Novels are the Socratic dialogues of our time, and this free form has become the refuge of common sense in its flight from pedantry. 27. The critic is a reader who ruminates, therefore he ought to have more than one stomach. 28. Feeling, for a particular art, science, person, etc., is divided spirit, is self-restriction, hence a result of self-creation and self-destruction. 30. In modern tragedy, fate is sometimes replaced by God the Father, more often by the devil himself. How is it that this hasn't yet inspired some scholar to formulate a theory of the diabolic genre? 36. Whoever hasn't yet arrived at the clear realization that there might be a greatness existing entirely outside his own sphere, and for which he might have absolutely no feeling, whoever hasn't at least felt obscure intimations concerning the approximate location of this greatness in the geography of the human spirit, that person either has no genius in his own sphere, or else he hasn't been educated yet to the niveau of the classic. 37. In order to write well about something, one shouldn't be interested in it any longer. To express an idea with due circumspection, one must have relegated it wholly to one's past. One must no longer be preoccupied with it. As long as the artist is in the process of discovery and inspiration, he is in a state which, as far as communication is concerned, is, at the very least, intolerant. He wants to blurt out everything, which is a fault of young geniuses or a legitimate prejudice of old bunglers, and so he fails to recognize the value and the dignity of self-restriction, which is, after all, for the artist as well as the man, the first and the last, the most necessary and the highest duty. Most necessary because wherever one does not restrict oneself, one is restricted by the world, and that makes one a slave. The highest because one can only restrict oneself at those points and places where one possesses infinite power, self-creation, and self-destruction. Even a friendly conversation, which cannot be broken off at any moment, completely arbitrarily, has something intolerant about it. But a writer who can and does talk himself out, who keeps nothing back for himself, and likes to tell everything he knows, is to be pitied. There are only 3 mistakes to guard against. First, what appears to be unlimited free will, and consequently seems and should seem to be irrational or supra-rational, nonetheless must still at bottom be simply necessary and rational. Otherwise, the whim becomes willful, becomes intolerant, and self-restriction turns into self-destruction. Second, Don't be in too much of a hurry for self-restriction, but first give free rein to self-creation, invention, and inspiration, until you're ready. Third, don't exaggerate self-restriction. 40. In the sense in which it has been defined and used in Germany, aesthetic is a word which notoriously reveals an equally perfect ignorance of the thing and of the language. Why is it still used? 48. Irony is the form of paradox. Paradox is everything simultaneously good and great. 51. To use wit as an instrument for revenge is as shameful as using art as a means for titillating the senses. 52. Instead of description, one occasionally gets in poems a rubric announcing that here something or other should really have been described, but the artist was prevented from doing so and most humbly begs to be excused. 53. In respect to their unity, most modern poems are allegories, mysteries, moralities, or novellas, adventures, intrigues, or a mixture or dilution of these. 54. There are writers who drink the absolute like water, and books in which even the dogs refer to the infinite. 55. A really free and cultivated person ought to be able to attune himself at will to being philosophical or philological, critical or poetical, historical or rhetorical, ancient or modern, quite arbitrarily, just as one tunes an instrument at any time and to any degree. 56. Wit is logical sociability. 57. If some mystical art lovers who think of every criticism as a dissection and every dissection as a destruction of pleasure were to think logically, then wow would be the best criticism of the greatest work of art. To be sure, there are critiques which say nothing more, but only take much longer to say it. 58. Just as mankind prefers a great to a just action, so too the artist wants to ennoble and instruct. 59. Chamfort's pet idea that wit is a substitute for an impossible happiness, a small percentage, as it were, of the unpaid debt on the greatest good for which a bankrupt nature must settle, is not much better than Shaftesbury's idea that wit is the touchstone of truth, or the more vulgar prejudice that moral ennoblement is the highest end of the fine arts. Wit is its own end, like virtue, like love and art. This brilliant man felt, so it seems, the infinite value of wit, and since French philosophy is inadequate for an understanding of this, he sought instinctively to join what was best in him to what is first and best in that philosophy. And as a maxim, the thought that the wise man must confront fate always en état d'épigramme is beautiful and truly cynical. 60. All the classical poetical genres have now become ridiculous in their rigid purity. 61. Strictly understood, the concept of a scientific poem is quite as absurd as that of a poetical science. 62. We already have so many theories about poetical genres. Why have we no concept of poetical genre? Perhaps then we would have to make do with a single theory of poetical genres. 63. Not art and works of art make the artist, but feeling, and inspiration, and impulse. 64. There should be a new laocoon to determine the limits of music and philosophy. For a proper appreciation of a number of literary works, we still need a theory of grammatical music. 65. Poetry is republican speech, a speech which is its own law and end unto itself, and in which all the parts are free citizens and have the right to vote. 67. In England, wit is at least a profession, if not an art. There, everything becomes craftsmanlike, and in that island, even the roués are pedants. So too their wits. They introduce an absolute willfulness, whose illusion gives to wit its romantic and piquant quality, into reality, and so manage to live wittily. Hence their talent for folly. They die for their principles. 70. People who write books and imagine that their readers are the public, and that they must educate it, soon arrive at the point not only of despising their so-called public, but of hating it, which leads absolutely nowhere. 73. What is lost in average, good, or even first-rate translations is precisely the best part. 78. Many of the very best novels are compendia, encyclopedias of the whole spiritual life of a brilliant individual, works which have this quality, even if they are cast in a completely different mold, like Nathan, thereby take on a novelistic hue. And every human being who is cultivated and who cultivates himself contains a novel within himself, but it isn't necessary for him to express it and write it out. 80. I'm disappointed in not finding in Kant's family tree of basic concepts the category almost, a category that has surely accomplished and spoiled as much in the world and in literature as any other. In the mind of natural skeptics, it colors all other concepts and perceptions. 84. From what the moderns aim at, we learn what poetry should become. From what the ancients have done, what it has to be. 85. Every honest author writes for nobody or everybody. Whoever writes for some particular group does not deserve to be read. 86. The function of criticism, people say, is to educate one's readers. Whoever wants to be educated, let him educate himself. This is rude, but it can't be helped. 89. Isn't it unnecessary to write more than one novel unless the artist has become a new man? It's obvious that frequently all the novels of a particular author belong together, and in a sense make up only one novel. 90. Wit is an explosion of confined spirit. 91. The ancients are not the Jews, Christians, or English of poetry. They are not an arbitrarily chosen artistic people of God, nor do they have the only true saving aesthetic faith, nor do they have a monopoly on poetry. 93. In the ancients we see the perfected letter of all poetry. In the moderns we see its growing spirit. 96. A good riddle should be witty. Otherwise nothing remains once the answer has been found, and there's a charm in having a witty idea which is enigmatic to the point of needing to be solved. Only its meaning should be immediately and completely clear as soon as it's been hit upon. 98. The following are universally valid and fundamental laws of written communication. 1. One should have something to communicate. 2. One should have somebody to whom one wants to communicate it. 3. One should really be able to communicate it and share it with somebody, not simply express oneself. Otherwise it would be wiser to keep silent. 99. Whoever isn't completely new himself judges the new as if it were old, and the old seems ever new until one grows old oneself. 100. The poetry of one writer is termed philosophical, of another philological, of a third rhetorical, etc. But what then is poetical poetry? 103. Many works that are praised for the beauty of their coherence have less unity than a motley heap of ideas simply animated by the ghost of a spirit and aiming at a single purpose. What really holds the latter together is that free and equal fellowship in which, so the wise men assure us, the citizens of the perfect state will live at some future date. It's that unqualifiedly sociable spirit which, as the beau monde maintains, is now to be found only in what is so strangely and almost childishly called the great world. On the other hand, many a work of art whose coherence is never questioned is, as the artist knows quite well himself, not a complete work but a fragment, or one or more fragments, a mass, a plan. But so powerful is the instinct for unity in mankind that the author himself will often bring something to a kind of completion which simply can't be made a whole or a unit, often quite imaginatively and yet completely unnaturally. The worst thing about it is that whatever is draped about the solid, really existent fragments in the attempt to mug up a semblance of unity consists largely of dyed rags. And if these are touched up cleverly and deceptively and tastefully displayed, then that's all the worse, for then he deceives even the exceptional reader at first, who has a deep feeling for what little real goodness and beauty is still to be found here and there in life and letters. That reader is then forced to make a critical judgment to get at the right perception of it, and no matter how quickly the dissociation takes place, still the first fresh impression is lost. 107. The ancients are masters of poetical abstraction. The moderns are better at poetical speculation. 108. Socratic irony is the only involuntary and yet completely deliberate dissimulation. It is equally impossible to feign it or divulge it. To a person who hasn't got it, it will remain a riddle even after it is openly confessed. It is meant to deceive no one except those who consider it a deception, and who either take pleasure in the delightful roguery of making fools of the whole world, or else become angry when they get an inkling they themselves might be included. In this sort of irony, everything should be playful and serious, guilelessly open and deeply hidden. It originates in the union of savoir-vivre and scientific spirit, in the conjunction of a perfectly instinctive and a perfectly conscious philosophy. It contains and arouses a feeling of indissoluble antagonism between the absolute and the relative, between the impossibility and the necessity of complete communication. It is the freest of all licenses, for by its means one transcends oneself, and yet it is also the most lawful, for it is absolutely necessary. It is a very good sign when the harmonious bores are at a loss about how they should react to this continuous self-parody, when they fluctuate endlessly between belief and disbelief until they get dizzy, and take what is meant as a joke seriously and what is meant seriously as a joke. For Lessing, irony is instinct. For Hemsterhuis, it is classical study. For Hülsen, it arises out of the philosophy of philosophy and surpasses these others by far. 109. Gentle wit, or wit without a barb, is a privilege of poetry which prose can't encroach upon, for only by means of the sharpest focus on a single point can the individual idea gain a kind of wholeness. 112. The analytic writer observes the reader as he is, and accordingly he makes his calculations and sets up his machines in order to make the proper impression on him. The synthetic writer constructs and creates a reader as he should be. He doesn't imagine him calm and dead, but alive and critical. He allows whatever he has created to take shape gradually before the reader's eyes, or else he tempts him to discover it himself. He doesn't try to make any particular impression on him, but enters with him into the sacred relationship of deepest sim-philosophy or sim-poetry. 115. The whole history of modern poetry is a running commentary on the following brief philosophical text. All art should become science, and all science art. Poetry and philosophy should be made one. 117. Poetry can only be criticized by way of poetry. A critical judgment of an artistic production has no civil rights in the realm of art if it isn't itself a work of art, either in its substance, as a representation of a necessary impression in the state of becoming, or in the beauty of its form and open tone, like that of the old Roman satires. 118. Isn't everything that is capable of becoming shop-worn already twisted or trite to begin with? 121. The simplest and most immediate questions, like should we criticize Shakespeare's works as art or as nature, and are epic and tragedy essentially different or not, and should art deceive or merely seem to do so, are all questions that can't be answered without the deepest consideration and the most erudite history of art. 123. It is thoughtless and immodest presumption to want to learn something about art from philosophy. There are many who start out that way as if they hope to find something new there, since philosophy, after all, can't and shouldn't be able to do more than order the given artistic experiences and the existing artistic principles into a science, and raise the appreciation of art, extend it with the help of a thoroughly learned history of art, and create here as well that logical mood which unites absolute tolerance with absolute rigor.